Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Dr. Kinyanjui Koimbori is agriculture and climate change scientist with us in studio. Good morning, Dr. Your time is appreciated. Many thanks. Yes. And we're also joined by Kaluki Paul, who is the Africa Youth Climate Assembly member. Your time is equally appreciated.
Thank you.
And later we'll be talking to a representative from the Ministry of Environment as we take stock of the forthcoming climate summit here in the county of Nairobi as well, kicking off that discussion here on the broadcast. Dr. I first begin with you, and certainly Monday will be a big day for Kenya and the African continent, but can this summit before the COP28 climate conference later in the year in the United Arab Emirates address the thorny issues that have been ever constant, looking at it from the 26th climate conference, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then heading to 28th? Can the sticky and the thorny issues be addressed?
Yes, thank you so much for the invite. And before I begin, let me just say that what we're looking at in the coming week, that is from 4th to 8th, because we are planning to have the Africa Climate Week, and also we are planning to have the Africa Climate Summit. Yeah. We are hoping to see some steps now in terms of moving from policy making and all these promises that we did in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We are trying to see now we move into action. And that's why the theme for the Africa Climate Summit or Climate Week is all about growth and climate finance. And when you look at growth and climate finance, this is very essential because we are trying to look into how can Africa grow and how can Africa at the same time take advantage of the climate finance space. And that's why you are seeing that 3 essential SDGs will be the main focus of these meetings. That is SDG 7, which is on affordable and clean energy. We have SDG number 13, which is on climate action, and SDG number 17, which is on partnership for goals. So when you look at the 3 SDGs that will be of the main focus, they will obviously be a pivoting point for Africa. Okay. If we take the right people to this panel, if we take the right congregation that will obviously be spearheading what Africa needs in terms of having money so that we can be able to climate-proof our infrastructures, so that we can be able also to have climate-smart agriculture, which is also at the backbone of agriculture, coming from the backdrop of drought, where we had Kenya experiencing the worst drought. And right now we are hoping that we get a bumper harvest. And all this actually trickles down to having money that is in terms of climate finance. So we are looking forward to it, expecting that Kenya gains out of it. Okay. And actually we are hoping this will also increase into the GDP of Kenya eventually, because we're expecting a lot of people coming outside Kenya, more than 10,000 people coming. And this is something also we are going to discuss moving forward in terms of what are the challenges you expect next week and what suggestions can we have for the government to streamline this process. Because 10,000 people in Kenya at one time in Nairobi, I have a few suggestions for a few ministries, of which maybe we can be able to dwell in at a later time.
Okay. Before you go to Paul, when you talk about the financing question here, it's Kenya, it's Africa, not known to be the biggest of polluters or of carbon emissions, but bearing the consequences of the same. Yeah. But can there be an outcome of a can-do spirit from this summit in Nairobi, which will compel the richer nations to fund mitigation efforts because they are the biggest polluters? It isn't Kenya, it isn't Egypt, it isn't Namibia, it isn't SA, it isn't Senegal. The Saudis, the Americans, the Indians, the English, the Germans, I mean, Australia. Can there be an outcome that will compel these richer nations to pay for the consequences of their actions?
Loss and damage is something we had pushed for within COP27, so that the richer nations, which actually benefited at our expense for them to become developed, to pay us. Because now they're telling us to stop or not to even think about using the fossil fuel kind of energy sources. And this is what actually they used to make them developed. So for us to reach where they are, even in the next coming 40, 50 years, we need to move into the fossil fuel energy space. But at the same time, they're telling us that is not viable because it obviously will pollute the environment. So we're telling them, pay us for the space you had used or for the environmental space you had degraded so that you become developed. So what we are saying is that we saw one thing in the COP27 in that they didn't want to admit liability and they didn't want to actually become liable in terms of compensating. So what they were saying is we can set aside money within the Green Climate Fund for you so that you can be able to access it. Okay. But one thing we are seeing, it is not law abiding. There is no law that is binding them. So we cannot take them to court. Yeah. It is only on a volunteer kind of basis. So all these things that we are saying here, it all trickles down to humanity. That is, we all want to survive. All right. So that's all that we have. It's all about goodwill. Okay.
Kaluki Paul, from the perspective of the young Kenyans and the young Africans who will attend, some will follow, of course, the proceedings from KICC, with what prism are you looking into this summit? How significant is it?
Thanks so much. And maybe before I start, allow me to quickly pay some tribute to one Brian Okoth, who was one of the people helping us to see that there's meaningful engagement of African youth in this summit. Brian departed from the face of the earth to an accident, but we shall remember Brian for what he was. He was a strong champion for young people, and he made sure that we really have a space in the government, space in the civil society to really engage in this space. Okay. But moving forward, I think one of the things that young people in Africa are looking at is that agenda on green growth and investing in Africa's youth. We are looking at bringing over 400 youth. Actually now we had over 600 of them being confirmed. And the whole clarion call is actually young people are the sources of the solutions. They are the innovators in the continent. And so if we must plan for them, think about climate finance, think about climate mobility and immobility. It's actually the young people of the continent who are bringing the solutions. So for us at the Africa Youth Climate Assembly and youth organizations, we are actually pushing for young people being at the center and actually showcasing all these innovations and solutions and really the voices on what's happening on the ground in the communities and why it's important for them to be in such a key gathering to speak to their governments, to speak to the leaders that are being brought together, and also really coerce investors to really look the way of the young people and invest, put the money where young people need most to be able to scale up and do the projects that they are doing on the ground.
And what then becomes of the role that you play as young Kenyans and young Africans, the policymakers aside, the people in positions of influence aside? I mean, what will be your role then in championing for growth, green climate, and the financing of that aspect or element?
Yeah, so you must know that there is the Africa Youth Climate Declaration that we have been engaging all African youth since about late May. And the whole idea is we need to package these solutions or programs that young people are doing across Africa in a very palatable way in the policy making space. Because again, I think without policy, then we can do all we are doing on the streets in our communities, but nothing will be taken up. So the Africa Youth Climate Declaration will be the very vehicle that we're actually using for young people to have a space in government, to have a space in the investor world where young people can then access the money, where people can then be in the leadership space to actually influence whatever outcomes that we are thinking of. And of course, there's a bit of the roadmap that we want young people to also be aware of. And right, the climate summit is just a beginning, right? And Kenya as a host is trying to galvanize African governments and communities on how best we can negotiate on equal terms with the global north. And our key message is an African bloc towards COP28. So basically, the declaration sought to house all these solutions and the recommendations that we have, especially on climate financing, on youth inclusion in key decision making, and also really allowing for us to exhibit and benefit from the innovations and projects that young people are doing across the continent.
Okay. Daktari, allow me to quote what the head of state had said. And President Ruto is on record for saying climate action is not a global north issue or a global south issue. It is our collective challenge and it affects all of us. We need to come together and find the common global solutions. But I'm looking at the numbers in terms of the climate financing and adaptation and of roughly $80 billion US, rich countries spent on climate finance for poor countries in 2019, only a quarter was spent on adaptation. That's about $20 billion US.
Yeah.
I mean, even before this summit starts on Monday, there clearly is the question of financing here. Will it be an agenda that will be debated and answers or solutions, therefore, come out of it as a united front from the continent for this summit happening in Nairobi?
Yeah, this is something that we are hoping to see come into light, because this is something we have been pushing for a very long time. And something that African nations have been bashed on for a very long time is they're always asking for all this money to go into climate adaptation, climate mitigation. But the downside is that they don't have the what do you call it, the instruments and the framework which are supposed to be set before that. That is a monitoring and evaluation system. So we cannot be asking for this money and yet don't have the system and the tools which are enshrined within these governing bodies, that every African nation that wants to access this money, it should have a framework so that it can be able to monitor this money and these funds. Okay. So most of these African nations, they just want access to this money. And if they are asked, how can you be able to monitor and track the usage of this money, they're not able to account for it. And that's why you see most of these developed nations, they are skeptical in terms of dispersing the money because they're not able to track each and every usage of this money. We cannot shy away from Africa being, obviously, being shadowed by corruption right and left. And you have seen this money being used sometimes for other reasons which they were not supposed to. Take an example for these counties. Every county has money set aside for climate and even environmental protection, because every county within the nationally determined contribution, they were supposed to come with their own climate policies so that they can be able to come up with their own climate change fund and all these things. So there is money already for climate proofing and climate adaptation within the counties. But we are not seeing this money going into action. Recently, we have been having floods. We had drought. And you see the counties are the ones which are calling on the national government, asking for funds. I think also I saw one of the stories within the arid and semi-arid areas. One of these counties, they were saying they had allocated money even for development. They had to send that money and reallocate that money for climate change disasters. So you see, this is also a discussion that we need to look at, because if we don't have money set aside for adaptation and mitigation, we might end up using money that was meant for other development purposes to actually go into adaptation and mitigation. So what we are saying is that the clarion call that the president has made in terms of climate financing is very essential. And we are hoping the investors will come with solutions and real-time solutions, because when you talk about climate finance solutions, there are so many. They range from smart agriculture, they range from early warning and early response systems. They range for so many things that we need to look into. Even the low-hanging fruits. Here we're talking about clean cooking solutions. That's a climate smart solution that we can be looking into. And even the space of carbon credits. That's a space we can look into. Even the smart GECOs, they're earning carbon credits from these smart GECOs that we are seeing. Okay. So carbon credit is another way also we can climate finance ourselves. So this is also a space we need to discuss, as much as also encouraging the government to shy away from lifting the the forest ban, because we have seen other countries gaining from carbon credits. As I had said here earlier, is that Gabon has a forest cover of 88%. Kenya has a forest cover of around 12%. So you cannot equate 88 and 12%. And Gabon won $17 million in 1 year because of preserving their forest. And in Kenya, we are targeting towards eliminating our forest cover. So we should be looking into how can we increase our forest cover, and how can we use this forest cover to gain carbon credits, which are worth millions of dollars, as opposed to opening the forest for loggers to go in. Okay,
and when you mention that, here will be a congregation of policymakers and heads of states and government. You have attended the COP27 climate conference, and even as we talk about the financing question and the mitigation measures, is it paramount for them to also deliberate on increasing our forest cover, the planting of trees, and the very opposite direction or directive given by the government on lifting the ban on logging? How counterproductive will that be?
Yes, it will be, because you cannot talk about climate adaptation or mitigation without putting the aspects of forests. Because when you're talking about carbon sinks, we are talking, what is the main purpose of all these meetings we are having? Is to see whether we can, which are the solutions we have at hand to reduce carbon emissions, and at the same time to make sure the global temperatures don't increase. And also, as we are doing that, what can we do to adapt or to mitigate towards the climate change that we are feeling at this moment? So forest covers and the issues of increased forest cover, those are the low-hanging fruits. The low-hanging fruits are when you talk about nature-based solutions. In nature-based solutions, planting of trees comes at the topmost level, because we are not in the level of developed nations. When you look at the United Arab Emirates, they are using advanced methods which are not nature-based solutions, which are scientifically based solutions. That is the use of cloud seeding. Okay. Cloud seeding is where you take an aeroplane in the clouds, it injects electric currents, and it rains in an arid area. That's so expensive. In India, they have these fans, huge fans, which are able to absorb carbon in the atmosphere and release oxygen, which are worth billions. So in Africa, because we don't have that capability, the nature-based solution that we have is the usage of forest, planting of trees, conserving our marshland areas, our water catchment areas. These are the things we need to do because we don't have that money.
Thank you. Paul, coming to you. The call at some point during the COP26 climate conference was to the richer nations, pay up for your consequences or we perish altogether. It's now an African summit happening in the African continent. I mean, bringing the conversation closer to the doorstep of the African continent. What then collective outcome can come from this, which will inform the COP28 climate conference in the United Arab Emirates for a collective global approach to the problems of climate change?
I mean, definitely, and you're correct. I think I've taken part in at least 3 of these climate COPs in subsequent manner. One of the things that I think we appreciated is that the COP26 loss and damage fund that was announced, but without the money itself, right? And this year, seeing our very own president really calling for that like joint responsibility, that for sure we know that Africa and Kenya in this case accounts for less than 3% of the global greenhouse gases emissions. But now we're also saying that actually everyone has a role to play in this, right? Africa still has some bit of leadership in the climate space, and through the example is given in Gabon, we have countries like Madagascar, and even Kenya really, when we put out this whole lifting of the logging, we have some serious leadership. So right now, I think a key outcome will be how do African heads of states really commit to even having an African fund that can support climate adaptation and climate mitigation goals, right, in the lead up to COP28. And then how do we also use this as a pathway to compel global North and developed countries to equally pay up to their bit, because, I mean, of course, you see there's already several billions that have been announced by developed world countries since over 10 years ago, but that commitment has not been, disbursed to developing countries. So right now, I think it will be very important for African heads of states and also negotiators who are coming to Nairobi to sort of agree on that one language. Can we already set up an African fund on climate action and adaptation that will then actually compel global North countries to then play their bit and style up to deliver the loss and damage and really contribute the climate finance that is needed, and including the technology. Sometimes I think you find it very hard even for Africans to cope up with the impacts of the climate crisis, because when you think about the technology and who is asking you to go green, they are the same people controlling and running the innovations. So if you cannot transfer the technology, and it's already hard and expensive for Africans and African communities to invest in the climate space and cushion themselves against the impact of the climate, then how do you actually say we are playing on a fair field? So them actually ensuring there's a transfer of the technology from developed world to Africa and other global south countries would equally be a key outcome that African heads of state must push for, and ensuring that we enshrine all this into our policies. And the youth, again, I'll be quick to talk about young people's contribution in this, that for us to then also implement the technological solutions, then we must also invest in education and ensuring that young people have the platform to also understand the African landscape and how to also innovate, in a way that they can solve the African solutions with the African-based technological advancements.
Okay. Dr. what we are seeing across the world are not the consequences of the power of nature, but the consequences of human actions on it and the inability to protect against it. For example, if you take the example of the island nation of the Bahamas, I mean, if we'll not be unable as a world to keep temperatures, a modest increment of, taking or the sea level rises of up to 1 meter, which means increment in temperatures, then the entire island nation will be underwater, and the decry expressed by its leader during the climate conference in Glasgow. I mean, we have seen the consequences as well here on the opposite end of the severe drought, which had affected millions of Kenyans, pushing them on the brink of starvation because of the famine. From our perspective, have we invested enough across the counties? 1, 2, has enough awareness been created around the communities, impacting their lives as to the importance of conservation and also understanding the environment and the consequences of climate on their actions?
Thank you so much for that. And I'm happy I've been able to mention that point in terms of whether awareness has been created and whether money has been set aside in terms of climate financing, especially in the counties. And something you have mentioned is in terms of the rise in water levels. And these are some of the effects of climate change. Because climate, when you talk about climate change, is obviously the impacts of the rise in global surface temperatures, and this obviously trickles down to what we are seeing as the melting of the ice sheets and rising of water levels. And before I go into that, let me just mention that Africa has a huge advantage. In fact, 60% of the uncultivated arable land is in Africa. Globally, 60% of the uncultivated arable land is in Africa.
That's more than half of the world's arable land.
That means, in fact, statistics show that if this 60% can be taken advantage of in terms of smart agriculture and growing crops that can actually grow in these areas, then we can feed this whole world for a couple of years. So the downside...
As you mentioned that, I mean, when you talk about the arable state of the African land, half of the world here in the African continent, why then would 500 million people, about 500 million Africans, go to bed hungry?
Yes, that's a good question. The reason being that we have not adjusted to the climate, because the crops we are planting, and we have been planting, they are crops which are not obviously climate adapted. They are not hybrids. They are not crops which have adapted to the changing climate. And so you see the crops we are planting, and even the seasons, the farmers have not yet adjusted to the new seasons that we are having. So every time people are planting, they're ending up reaping what we call losses at the end. So what we need to do is to use technologies. That's why we're talking about climate financing solutions. We need technologies which can be able to be harnessed by the farmers at the ground level. We need farmers to have mobile apps which can give them instant messages on when do they need to plant, when do they need to reap, when are the onsets of rainfall seasons. And going back to the question you had mentioned in terms of, is there awareness? I can say awareness is there, but maybe the question you should be asking is, who is mandated with educating the masses? Who is this person mandated with educating the masses? The issue here is the messenger is the problem. The message is not the problem, it is the messenger. Once we leave the message to the politicians, they skew it to their advantage. And I'd mentioned it here sometimes back. Most of the politicians, sometimes back, had mentioned that one of the politicians had even mentioned that rain does not come from trees, it comes from the clouds. Some of them had even mentioned that trees obviously make our areas cold and we need them to be cut down. So the issue is not the message, the issue is the messenger. So what I'm pleading to the government is to ensure that the people who are sending out messages They are credible people. They are people who can be able to be trusted, because if you speak one thing today and one thing at the other end, then this is issues that we are seeing will cause a contradictory kind of message. And going into the Africa Climate Summit, we are hoping the large mass of these people who are going there, they are policymakers, there are scientists, there are people who will come up with immediate solutions. We saw this problem in COP27.
Okay.
The huge percentage of people who went there, the delegates, there were politicians and people working in the ministries, the busybodies in the government. And in fact, Kenya had the second largest number compared to any country globally that went to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh.
And the highest in Africa.
And the highest in Africa. So what we are saying is we need to see people who can go there to deliberate on matters to do with climate. We need people who are mandated with that task. We don't need busybodies. Let the busybodies stay at home, watch the television, read the newspapers, let people who are mandated with the policy making, policy changes, do their work, because right now we don't need talks. We don't need boardroom talks. We need solutions. We are now heading into what we call a pivotal point, whereby we will not be able to go back. So what we are calling for is immediate solutions in terms of having affordable, clean energy. And recently we had this national blackout. And that's one also calls for an alarming solution in terms of how can Kenya beef up their green energy space.
Okay. Paul, climate change, according to many observers, is moving faster than we are moving. Is this an understanding that, in your view, rings in the minds of policymakers that an action needs to be taken, and so very fast?
Thank you. Allow me to just quickly react to the comment that he brought, which I think is important. Of course, is a bit of Africa's large arable land, but we still have people facing starvation and livestock dying and everything. But for me, I think there's a bit that I also mentioned again, technology. Technology is very important. And I don't think it's a problem of production. It's a problem of how do we manage the food that we have? How do we manage the produce that we have? And we see in our local markets, if you ever walk to the centers, most of the times the food is so much in surplus, but because we don't have coolers or dryers, we end up losing this food. And so for me, I think it's a question of how do we also ensure we install the right technologies and devices necessary in these market centers, at the farm lots, and really along the transportation way to ensure we minimize on the food losses that it's been experienced by the communities. But coming back to your point, I think, honestly, there is a conversation on climate change. It's, of course, happening at a faster rate than humanity can respond to. But, of course, seeing the climate negotiations happening, seeing countries like Kenya hosting the Africa Climate Summit, and actually the African group of negotiators, every time meeting through the ministers, for instance, in Ethiopia, it just indicates that we are actually waking up to it. We're actually doing something about it. The question is about the speed. Are we up to the speed that is needed? Definitely not. But I think there is that bit of improvement. People are in the right trajectory, working towards ensuring that there's a commitment and everyone plays their key role to, deliver the climate solutions and really commit to the policies that we must implement from announcements to action and implementation on the ground. So definitely, I think people are moving. Maybe not at the speed that we need to, but definitely there's a conversation on solutions and implementation and transferring the finances to support the most vulnerable communities, of which Africa falls, and there are several other developing world countries.
And so very fast is the climate change moving, and the need to catch up, according to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. We welcome your contributions and we'll sample them in the course of this broadcast. More after the break. Stay tuned.